man must do his bit.
Welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. Today we examine the question of transnational crime. Many Guyanese visiting Bartica would have seen a grim monument at the waterfront. Guyanese driving along Young Street in Ivleary, Kingston, would have seen a monument to what the police call fallen heroes. Even in Buxton, there's a huge monument to persons who were killed. These were all victims of a period of Guyanese history which we know as the Troubles, the first decade of the present millennium, when hundreds of people were killed, policemen were killed, more policemen were killed than in any other time of our history. Perhaps more Guyanese were murdered. They were victims of massacres. There was rampant narcotics trafficking. There was trafficking in persons. There was trafficking in guns. There was maritime piracy. There was money laundering, illegal landing of aircraft. All of these occurrences took place during the first decade of this millennium. The Troubles. Why did the Troubles come about? Yes, some persons have attributed the Troubles to political rivalry. Others have claimed there was ethnic conflict. But in reality, this was an abnormal period, and in my view, the big problem during that period was caused by narcotics trafficking. Once we had so much drugs being pumped into the country, the drugs were accompanied by guns. The guns caused violence, caused death, and this death was meted out sometimes to innocent persons. Once you have drugs, you're going to have guns. Once you have guns, you're going to have murders, massacres, and in fact, during that period of the Troubles, there were over a dozen massacres. Sometimes 4, 5, 8, 10 people were killed at one time. So that's what the monument is about in Bartica. That's what the monument is about in Ivleary, the massacres. After the APNU-AFC administration entered office, things came to a halt. The Troubles came to a halt. As we tried to rebuild the security forces, we tried to rebuild confidence in the law enforcement agencies. And as you know, piracy almost disappeared. The landing of illegal aircraft almost disappeared. But over the last year, we've seen the return of serious cocaine smuggling. Only last week, we were told that on the 25th of November, a large shipment of cocaine was found in rum of Guyanese origin. We know that Guyana doesn't produce cocaine, so the cocaine had to come from a foreign country, Transnational. And last year also we had a large shipment of cocaine that turned up in Antwerp, in Belgium, and then we had some turned up in Hamburg. All this has happened since the APNU-AFC coalition left office. All this has happened over the last 12 months. And we need to look at the causes of transnational crime. Well, we know Guyana has over 3,000 kilometers of land frontier. We have a long coastline. And it's clear that in a small country that doesn't produce cocaine, we're exporting millions of dollars worth of cocaine to Northern Europe, a country that does not have guns. We have returned to execution murders. And because of our long, open, porous borders, we find that there has been a lot of people trafficking. Sometimes you see persons of, who come from other South American countries or even the Caribbean islands showing up in the nightclubs and the barroom bars and other places around town. And then, of course, you have guns. Very often when guns are used to commit crimes, these are the guns which have been brought into the country illegally. We don't manufacture guns, and many of those guns are unlicensed. What does transnational crime do to a small country like Guyana? To start with, at a personal level, I feel that it creates what I call a secondary impact. Many of the young persons who were just kids, just babes in 2000 when the trouble started, learned violence. They didn't learn to settle disputes, in a consensual way. They became violent. They tried to replicate the violence that they saw in the streets. And this is one reason why you have such a big criminal problem today. Many of the young persons in town and country feel that violence is the way to solve disputes. And this is what I call the secondary impact. The first impact was, of course, the murders. The secondary impact is the impact it had on young people and other persons who have used violence to settle their disputes. And it will go on a long time before we solve this problem of the secondary impact. It has distorted the economy because many people became fabulously rich. When you look at the figures coming out of the size of the cocaine busts in Amsterdam, Antwerp, and Hamburg, these are not small amounts. If you want small amounts, you go into some marijuana plot, up in one of our rivers. But this is massive. And a lot of people became fabulously rich. And this distorted the economy. Many people drifted away from, normal farming and went into marijuana farming. And many people drifted away from normal import-export and went into money laundering. Of course, there was political conflict too, because some parties felt that they needed to protect the party members or their sympathizers who were victims, and of course this led to political conflict. Whether or not they felt that the troubles were the result of politics, it certainly had a political impact. In my view, the troubles were really caused by narcotics trafficking, and we need to deal with that as an issue. So that now that we are heading towards this so-called decade of development, at least in my view, it ought to have been a decade of development. We need to examine the impact of transnational crime. We are part of the continent, and we will never be able to shut our borders completely, but we need to put in place measures to stamp out transnational crime. My friends, Guyana is a party to the United Nations Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. And we are also subject to what the convention calls for. We have an obligation to enforce that convention by our government. Our government has an obligation. We need to prevent, to suppress, and to punish persons who participate in transnational crimes. Now, this is a government obligation, and we cannot simply blame this gangster or that gangster, although we know that in some notorious cases, a well-known gangster, went to a foreign country where he was arrested, taken to a third country, and moved to a fourth country where he was later incarcerated. But it is our government's responsibility, in the first instance, to suppress and to prevent and punish criminals, and not allow other countries to do that for us. And unfortunately, during the Troubles, this is one of the characteristics of the government of the day. It did not seek vigorously to enforce the United Nations Convention against Transnational Organized Crime, to which it put us at the height of the Troubles in 2004. Our government of the day signed that convention, but it failed to do what the convention called for. That is to prevent, to suppress, and to punish criminals. So was the United Nations Convention successful? It was successful for governments which complied with obligations under the convention. And unfortunately, during that period, our government was found wanting. In addition to that, and in fact, I refer to this period of the Troubles because it is also a period of the most intense I would say, engagement in the international community to suppress crime. And the Caribbean community, remember this was the period of the Cricket World Cup. Well, the West Indians go crazy during cricket. And we made a series of well-intentioned security agreements during that period. And they formed a very important package, which I believe Guyanese at the present time should re-examine. You know, we had the impacts, the implementation agency for crime and security. We had a joint regional communications center. We had the regional intelligence fusion center, and later on we set up a council for the ministers responsible for law enforcement, a consulate it was called. So there is a package, and before that, since 1982, the Caribbean had the regional security system, and although Guyana is not a member of the RSS, other organizations like such as CIDEMA, which has helped Guyana during the floods, are part of that. So we have a family of security and law enforcement agencies in CARICOM. The question is, as with the United Nations Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, the question is, has Guyana been compliant with the CARICOM security strategy, which was promulgated since 2013? And the question is, again, of implementation. Guyana signs on the dotted line, but the implementation is something else. The implementation calls for political will. It calls for bureaucratic organization, and it calls for ministries of foreign affairs and Ministry of Home Affairs, which are serious about implementing the very agreements which they voluntarily entered into. Now, in addition to those multilateral agreements under the United Nations and CARICOM, we need to look closer home. Guyana has a 1,300-kilometer border with Brazil, the Federative Republic of Brazil. It is quite likely that some of the guns used in crimes have been manufactured in Brazil. Brazil is, or it used to be, the 5th largest exporter, manufacturer and exporter of small arms, and some of you might be familiar with those Brazilian weapons. Well, we know that they're not manufactured under license in Guyana, and many of them come across the border, many of them come illegally. So over a period of years, and we have had relations with Brazil for over 50 years, we have had defense and security and military agreements with the Federative Republic of Brazil. And we had committed again, we signed on the dotted line to scores of agreements when the well-known former Minister of Home Affairs, Ronald Gadrad, was in office. He signed on behalf of the police, and their defense agreements, and we have agreements for, patrolling the borders. And again, we are all signatories to the United Nations Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. So we do have agreements with our whole CARICOM community, and we do have agreements with the biggest country on the continent, Brazil, a country with which we have the longest of our 3 frontiers. The question is, why hasn't Guyana been implementing the agreements which it signed with Brazil and with CARICOM? It's a question of obligation, governmental obligation, and of implementation. My friends, transnational crime is extremely serious. And it is for this reason that the United Nations, nearly 20 years ago, took the initiative. It's for this reason that the government of Guyana signed the agreement as early as 2004. It's for this reason that the government signed agreements with the Caribbean community It is for this reason that the government signed agreements with Brazil. And we must bear these in mind, because Guyana does not want to appear to be failing in its international obligations. Now, we all look forward to this decade of development. I used the expression for the first time in January 2020, before the general and regional elections. I felt that Guyana had a wonderful opportunity to deliver to the new generation persons who would be coming of age in this present decade, the benefits of our petroleum wealth, anticipated petroleum wealth. I felt it would be a time for young people to gain the best from education, that we could enjoy good employment, that we could have regular elections, that we could enjoy equality between the coastland and the hinterland, and that we could get the benefit of all of the public services that should be made available to the people of this country, which is boasting about the wealth it expects to get from petroleum. Now, I put a lot of emphasis on this decade of development, but to make that decade successful, we have to deal with the question of transnational crime. And it is a great disappointment that literally within weeks of entering office, the present administration completely dismantled the National Anti-Narcotics Agency. Now, a few years ago, when I was on the Joint Services Commission, I took pains as a commissioner to ask every one of the major political parties and major agencies coming before the commission what, in its view, or what in their view, was the single most significant contributor to criminal violence. And every one of them, without exception, said narco trafficking. And I believe they were right. And what has happened now is that narco trafficking has returned. So it was a shock, not surprise. It was a shock that when this administration entered office in August, by October, the National Anti-Narcotic Agency had gone. And let me say this. I'm not pretending that the National Anti-Narcotics Agency was perfect, but what I can say is that the CANU is not perfect. The Customs Anti-Narcotics Unit is a municipal organization. It is a canoe where we need a warship. It is impossible for CANU to suppress narcotics trafficking with its limited manpower, its limited assets over this whole country. And what is happening now, these discoveries that are turning up in Amsterdam, Antwerp, and Hamburg should not have occurred if we had a National Anti-Narcotics Agency which A, had the power to implement anti-narcotics legislation in Guyana, and B, to reach out to foreign countries. We have anti-narcotics plan. Many years ago, when I was National Security Advisor to the President under President Desmond Hoyt, in 1992, we had what is called a National Drug Strategy Master Plan. And there was a committee of which I was a member, and the President chaired it himself, called NADLEC, the National Drug Law Enforcement Committee. And when I entered office as president in May 2015, I established a National Anti-Narcotics Agency and also the National Intelligence and Security Agency, NISA and NANA. Now, if the present administration feels that the NANA was not capable or competent, build up its capability. Create a national organization which could reach out to Belgium and the Netherlands and to Germany and United States and try to suppress this transnational crime. We cannot do it on our own because we do not grow the coca, we do not produce cocaine, we do not control the shipping lanes. But there is much more that we can do in this country, and KANU is not doing it. KANU does not have the capability, and there's no point pretending that this is just a blip on the screen. It cannot be a blip on the screen that in 1 year we have had 3 multi-million-dollar drug busts turning of cocaine passing through Guyana, turning up in Europe. So what are we going to do? I would call for a complete review of the impact of transnational crime on Guyana. Let us see how, particularly narcotics trafficking, is affecting our country. Let us see what measures need to be put in place along our borders to prevent transnational crime. Let us revisit the Caribbean community strategy. Now, many people criticize CARICOM, but the CARICOM has very hard-working staff. And just as I discussed on a previous occasion about food security, we have a Caribbean agricultural policy, CAP. We have a Caribbean agricultural plan. And the bureaucrats have done their work. It is an excellent plan, but plans can't implement themselves. Similarly, we have a beautiful CARICOM security strategy, but that strategy cannot implement itself. That strategy needs the willing participation and implementation by governments. If you are going to suppress transnational crime, let us look again at CARICOM, because other countries are involved. How is it that Barbados doesn't have 3 massive drug busts in 12 months in Antwerp, and Hamburg, and Amsterdam? How is it that St. Lucia doesn't have these massive drug busts? Why is it Guyana alone has these massive drug busts? Obviously, there is something in Guyana that is allowing these transnational crimes to take place. So what are we going to do as a nation? Are we going to allow incompetence to continue to compromise the safety of our people and the security of our country? We saw what happened during the Troubles. The evidence is there, not only in the monuments, the evidence is there in the quality of life of our communities. Violence has been embedded. Gun crimes have been embedded. Narco-trafficking has been embedded in our communities. And it is difficult to uproot it once it gets started, because there is no will. There's no point trying to create SWAT teams to go there shooting and arresting persons. You have to create the conditions within those communities, within the country, which does not promote reliance on transnational crime, such as gun running and drug trafficking and people smuggling in order to survive. This all comes back, my friends, to the quality of 2 ministries, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Home Affairs. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs has to be empowered. It has to have the bureaucrats, the foreign service officers who could examine these protocols and conventions and agreements and ensure that they are implemented. I can refer to agreements signed by Minister Gadrat. Some people living today don't even know who he was, but he signed on the dotted line. It means that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is not supervising and calling the other ministries to book. Similarly, we have the Ministry of Home Affairs. Well, you don't keep a country safe by, blaming people for, blaming political activists for fires and other offenses. You solve the problems of drug trafficking, solve the problems of people smuggling, solve the problems of gun running. But what we see is passivity. What we need is a new approach by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Home Affairs, two very important ministries, if you're going to deal with transnational crime. Transnational crime is smothering Guyana's development, quite frankly. A lot of people have left this country because of drug smuggling and other forms of transnational crime. A lot of people will not come into the country to invest because it's an unsafe country. There is a lot of instability caused by people trafficking and gun running. And there's fear out there in some of the regions, in some of the areas. And we need to have a look at these two ministries. Does the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have the internal organizational and administrative capability to continuously review these agreements and ensure that the responsible ministry fulfills them? Or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs cannot do everything, but the Ministry of Foreign Affairs must be in touch with Brazil and keep abreast with the agreements it signed. They've recently signed some agreements with France. That's going to be another story. They've signed agreements with CARICOM. And oh yes, we need to ensure that those agreements with the Caribbean community are fulfilled. So on the one hand, we have a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is itself a signatory to these agreements. But it is partnered with the Ministry of Home Affairs, which is itself part of the implementation mechanism for these agreements. And if we had a higher level of competence in these two ministries, Guyana would be a better place. But there's no point dreaming about this good life. There's no point thinking that, oh, we'll have this cash bonanza and people will be flocking to Guyana. Transnational crime is the biggest impediment to development in Guyana. We could be much further along the way to building a harmonious society if we got rid of the scourge of transnational crime. We all saw what happened during the first decade of this millennium, roughly from 2000 to 2009, 2010. We know of the deaths, we know of the dislocation, we know of the damage to property, we know the damage to Guyana's reputation, and we now have a duty to the next generation to banish transnational crime. It cannot go away completely, but we can do more. We need, my friends, to establish institutions like the National Anti-Narcotics Agency, which protect Guyana from narcotics trafficking. We need to strengthen our Ministry of Foreign Affairs to make sure it keeps its finger on the pulse of these scores of agreements that have been entered into over the years. We need a strong Ministry of Home Affairs, which doesn't blame, crime on the people itself, but protects the people from the crimes which are caused by transnational crime, illegal guns and illegal immigration, illegal narcotics. This is the way we're going to overcome transnational crime, by having stronger ministries of foreign affairs and home affairs, and having a government which is committed to fulfill its obligations on the United Nations Convention, on the CARICOM security strategy, and the agreements we make with friendly countries like Brazil. Thank you.